Across the ancient world, there were places where history and belief intertwined so tightly that separating them became almost impossible. Egypt, during the height of its imperial strength, was one of those places. Every monument, every ritual, every decree issued from the royal palace was meant to reinforce the idea that the world was stable, orderly, and governed by a divine hierarchy in which Pharaoh stood as the earthly representative of cosmic balance. People from distant lands entered its borders, aware that they were walking into a civilization that considered itself the center of the universe. And yet, out of all the nations along the Nile, it would be Egypt that found itself confronted by a challenge unlike any it had known, one that would shake the pillars of its religion, its politics, and its sense of identity. Modern audiences often encounter the story of the plagues of Egypt as a series of dramatic events, but ancient listeners would have understood them in an entirely different light. For them, each plague was part of a dialogue between two worldviews. On one side stood the tightly woven ideological system of Egypt, where gods manifested in natural cycles, and where the king's authority depended on maintaining harmony between heaven and earth. On the other side emerged the God of Israel, a deity with no idol, temple, or image in Egypt, delivering a message that threatened to unravel Egypt's carefully crafted understanding of divine order. The tension between these two perspectives forms the backdrop of one of the most studied, debated, and misunderstood events in biblical history. Before any plague struck, there was a moment of confrontation that redefined the entire narrative. The Hebrew text describes Moses and Aaron standing before Pharaoh, not as rebels seeking freedom through revolt, but as envoys bearing a divine summons. They were instructed to demand that the Israelite people be allowed to serve their God in the wilderness, a command that Pharaoh instantly dismissed. In Egyptian thought, a request to leave for religious ritual was not unusual. Workers and priests sometimes traveled for ceremonies or festivals. What made this situation different was the identity of the deity issuing the demand. Pharaoh, who was considered a son of the gods, was being told that another divine authority superseded his own. The refusal was not simply political. It reflected Pharaoh's worldview. In the Egyptian language, declaring ignorance of a god did not mean atheism. It meant that the god held no recognized place in the cosmic order. By responding that he did not know the God of Israel, Pharaoh asserted that this deity possessed no rightful claim over Egypt and no power to disrupt its balance. Yet the narrative subtly reveals the fragility of this position. Egypt's stability depended on forces it believed it understood, but these forces were about to be reshaped in ways that defied explanation through familiar rituals or priestly knowledge. Archaeological records of New Kingdom Egypt show a society deeply invested in interpreting natural events as messages from the divine. Priests studied the Nile's behavior, the patterns of stars, the rise of insects after seasonal floods, and the illnesses that struck crops or animals. Their goal was to identify whether these occurrences aligned with cosmic harmony or represented disturbances that required ritual correction. This framework is crucial for understanding the impact of the first plague. When the river turned red, it would not have been dismissed as mere discoloration. It would have been read as a sign that something in the relationship between gods and kingdom had ruptured. Environmental research has shown that the Nile occasionally experienced red coloration due to algal blooms high sediment loads, or unusual temperature shifts that encouraged bacterial growth. These changes, while natural, were rare enough to stir anxiety in ancient observers. But what made the biblical account distinct was not simply the hue of the water, it was the timing, scale, and symbolic meaning attached to it. The Nile was more than a river. It was considered the bloodstream of the god Hapi, the source of Egypt's fertility and wealth. When its waters transformed, the Egyptians saw a sacred artery wounded, as if the lifeblood of the land itself rebelled. Documents from later Egyptian periods describe similar anxieties. When the Nile failed or behaved unpredictably, scribes interpreted it as a sign that the gods were displeased or that foreign influences had disturbed the realm. In light of this, the biblical description gains greater historical depth. The river turning red would have challenged not only economic expectations, fishing, transportation, and irrigation, but spiritual confidence. The priests, responsible for maintaining ritual purity, would have found themselves unable to cleanse the water or reverse the transformation through familiar rites. The historical landscape of the Nile also adds another layer. Scholars note that a major algal bloom could lead to the death of fish, a rise in bacterial activity, and disruptions to ecosystems further down the chain, events that align with the progression of subsequent plagues. Yet the biblical narrative emphasizes selective impact and coordinated intensity, features that distinguish it from purely natural cycles. In ancient thought, natural events became instruments of divine judgment when they displayed patterns that surpassed ordinary experience. The Israelites had witnessed harsh conditions before, but this was different. This was a suffocating transformation of an entire life-giving river. The psychological shock on Egypt would have been immense. People gathered at the shores to draw water, only to find the river undrinkable and foul. Fishermen whose livelihoods depended on the Nile watched their catches float lifeless on the surface. Harbors became scenes of confusion as boats searched for usable water upstream, often in vain. Texts from various regions of the ancient Near East describe how communities responded to sudden natural catastrophes through lamentations, appeals to gods, and frantic ritual activity. It is not difficult to imagine similar reactions in Egypt during the first plague. Meanwhile, the Hebrew people, long oppressed under harsh labor, witnessed events that shifted the balance of power. Their God, who until now had seemed distant or silent amid suffering, was reshaping the environment around them. The story does not portray them as warriors rising in revolt. Rather, they become observers to a contest of wills between the God who called them and the empire that controlled their bodies. The tension is palpable. Ancient Egypt standing on one side with centuries of tradition and divine kingship, and a previously marginalized community on the other, empowered by a message that transcended political structure. Another dimension becomes clear when studying the theological symbolism. In Egyptian belief, water represented life, purification, and rebirth. Temples included sacred basins used for ritual cleansing. Priests washed daily to maintain purity before entering holy spaces. When the water source of the nation was defiled, ritual purity collapsed. The priests, who normally stood as mediators between gods and people, found themselves unable to perform their essential role. Historical records show that priests losing ritual purity could not function, and this would have reinforced the perception that Egypt was spiritually destabilized. Furthermore, the timing indicated in the biblical account adds weight to the interpretation. The first plague occurs early in the sequence, serving as a philosophical blow rather than a lethal one. It does not destroy structures or kill citizens directly. It attacks assumptions. Egypt believed it understood the forces governing its prosperity. This event suggested otherwise. And within the context of the narrative, it marked a boundary crossed. The God of Israel was no longer merely issuing a verbal command. He was altering the very elements Egypt considered sacred. As the days progressed and the river remained unusable, the Egyptians sought alternative water sources, digging around the Nile to find fresh groundwater. This detail, preserved in the text, aligns with archaeological understanding of how ancient peoples responded to contaminated river systems. It demonstrates a realistic survival strategy while reinforcing the severity of the event. The Nile, normally a symbol of abundance, had become a place people avoided. Its transformation was visible from royal palaces to rural villages. The confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh continued throughout this episode. Pharaoh's heart, described in Hebrew with language that can mean hardened, strengthened, or made heavy, indicates a ruler resisting both political pressure and theological upheaval. In Egyptian culture, the concept of a heavy heart was associated with moral failure during the afterlife judgment, where hearts were weighed against the feather of truth. The irony becomes striking. A ruler claiming divine alignment is portrayed as spiritually imbalanced, even as his kingdom faces phenomena that test his authority. Yet it is important to recognize that Pharaoh was not acting irrationally. From his perspective, Egypt had seen unusual events before. Priests had responded to omens, storms, and mysterious shifts in the Nile's behavior. Egypt's world was resilient. The real challenge lay in recognizing whether this event was a natural disturbance or the beginning of a deeper conflict involving a god he had never acknowledged. That ambiguity created the tension that permeates the entire narrative. By the time the first plague subsided, Egypt had been forced into an uncomfortable realization. The forces shaping its reality were no longer following expected patterns. The nation that prided itself on cosmic order was encountering something beyond its theological boundaries. And while daily life resumed with cautious relief, a lingering question settled over both palace and field. Was this an isolated disruption? Or was Egypt standing at the threshold of a far greater reckoning? The answer would not come through political negotiations or priestly rituals. It would emerge through events that redefined the relationship between divine authority and earthly power. Events that unfolded across rivers, fields, skies, and even the households of the great empire. What began with the transformation of water would soon extend into every aspect of Egyptian life, challenging assumptions that had endured for centuries. When the Nile finally returned to its natural color and its waters regained their familiar clarity, Egypt must have felt a cautious sense of relief. The crisis had not destroyed the nation. Its systems still stood, its cities still functioned, and life began to resume its rhythms. Yet beneath this outward stability lay an undercurrent of unease. The first plague had challenged not only the physical foundation of Egyptian life, but the theological one. The river had been wounded, and with it, the confidence of those who believed the gods protected the land. Even after the waters cleared, the memory of their transformation lingered like an unresolved question. It is in this atmosphere of tension that the second plague emerges, one that seems deceptively simple on the surface. Frogs, creatures familiar to anyone who lived along the Nile's fertile banks, suddenly multiplied in overwhelming numbers. This was not the gentle seasonal rise associated with the annual flood, but a surge that pushed far beyond expectation. Historic Egyptian texts mention the appearance of frogs as a sign of renewal, a symbol of fertility and life. They were associated with the goddess Heket, whose image often bore the head of a frog, representing birth and resurrection. To Egyptians, the frog was not merely an animal. It was a sacred emblem woven into their understanding of creation. But the biblical account describes something profoundly different, an eruption of frogs so vast that they flooded into homes, bedrooms, and even royal chambers. Kitchens and ovens filled with them, disrupting the most basic aspects of daily life. What had once symbolized vitality now became a force of suffocating chaos. The theological inversion is striking. A symbol meant to represent the order of life had turned into an agent of disorder, challenging Egypt's belief that its gods maintained harmony in their domains. Scholars note that this transformation of sacred imagery into relentless disturbance reflects a powerful ancient rhetorical technique, undermining the legitimacy of rival deities by reversing their expected roles. From an ecological standpoint, the surge of frogs could follow naturally after a massive die-off of fish, the likely result of a contaminated river. Without fish to eat young frogs, amphibian populations can multiply rapidly. Archaeological studies of ancient river ecosystems show that such imbalances can lead to temporary explosions in frog numbers. Yet, what distinguishes this episode in the biblical narrative is not simply its biological plausibility, but its deliberate intensity and timing. The frogs appear not as random creatures responding to environmental shifts, but as part of a sequence targeting Egypt's religious symbols and its social order. For the Egyptians, this would have carried heavy implications. Temples dedicated to Heket viewed frogs as creatures under divine protection. Killing them was considered taboo. Yet now, the population was so overwhelming that normal life became unmanageable. Egyptians found themselves unable to move freely, prepare food, or maintain household rituals. A symbol of sacred fertility had become a burden impossible to escape. The tension this created between religious obligation and practical survival must have been profound. Priests would have attempted purification rituals, offerings, and incantations traditionally used to restore cosmic balance. But nothing changed. The frogs continued to swarm across the land, entering places even sacred animals typically avoided. The priests' inability to halt the phenomenon, after failing to reverse the transformation of the Nile, would have deepened public concern. The institution responsible for maintaining spiritual order was again shown powerless. Historical texts from Egypt reveal that priestly failure during crises weakened public trust and raised questions about divine favor. In this light, the second plague becomes not simply an inconvenience, but a challenge to the entire religious hierarchy. The biblical narrative also underscores the discomfort experienced by Pharaoh. Though seated at the pinnacle of Egyptian society, he was not immune to these events. Frogs entered the palace just as they entered the houses of common people. Such equalizing disruptions carried symbolic weight in ancient cultures. Pharaoh's palatial life was meant to reflect order, stability, and separation from common disturbances. The breach of that boundary served as a reminder that even the highest earthly authority could be touched by forces it could not control. It is here that Pharaoh takes an unusual step. Unlike after the first plague, he seeks relief through Moses and Aaron, promising that if the frogs are removed, he will allow the Israelites to offer sacrifices as requested. This moment is significant. It reflects not only Pharaoh's desperation, but also his recognition that the forces affecting Egypt fall under the domain of the God represented by Moses. Ancient kings rarely acknowledged foreign deities unless compelled by extraordinary circumstances. For Pharaoh to appeal in this way signals a temporary crack in his resistance, a moment where political calculation intersects with spiritual uncertainty. Yet, even this moment of concession is framed by tension. Moses allows Pharaoh to specify the time when relief should come, a detail that scholars interpret as a demonstration meant to show that the event is neither seasonal nor random. When the frogs die according to the designated timing, the episode reinforces the controlled nature of the phenomenon. For the Egyptians, the sudden death of countless frogs would have transformed the relief into yet another crisis. Piles of decaying animals contaminated the land and filled the air with a stench familiar to agrarian societies following mass animal die-offs. The problem did not disappear. It merely changed form. The death of the frogs also carries symbolic meaning. Heket, the goddess associated with life emerging from the waters, was commonly invoked to protect women during childbirth. Her symbol, new life springing forth, was now represented by heaps of dead frogs scattered across the land. In a culture where divine imagery was taken with utmost seriousness, such an inversion would have been deeply unsettling. It suggested not just temporary disorder, but a collapse in the protective role attributed to the goddess. Pharaoh, witnessing that the immediate crisis had passed, resumed his resistance. This cyclical pattern of concession followed by defiance appears repeatedly in ancient texts describing conflicts between kings and divine warnings. Human rulers often interpreted temporary relief as evidence that their authority still held. For Pharaoh, allowing the Israelites to depart would not only mean losing a labor force, but acknowledging a foreign deity's supremacy within Egyptian borders. His hardened resolve thus reflects political necessity intertwined with religious pride. The narrative then moves to the third plague, one that emerges without warning. Gnats, sometimes translated as lice, appear from the dust of the ground, spreading across people and animals alike. Unlike frogs, these creatures were not linked to a significant deity. Their appearance did not carry symbolic inversion, but rather targeted the vulnerability of human bodies and livestock. Numerous ancient texts from Egypt and Mesopotamia describe infestations of small biting insects as not merely nuisances, but spiritual disturbances. Such creatures were believed to cross boundaries between purity and impurity, disrupting rituals and contaminating sacred spaces. Priests, who maintained rigorous washing routines to preserve ritual purity, found themselves unable to continue their duties. The infestation reached into temples and disrupted ceremonies central to Egyptian religious life. Inscriptions from temple complexes reveal the importance of purity regulations, which governed who could enter sacred rooms, handle offerings, or perform daily rites. When insects made purity unattainable, the entire religious system ground to a halt. For the first time, the priests themselves acknowledge a reality they cannot avoid. They declare to Pharaoh that what they are witnessing is the finger of a god, a phrase reflecting ancient idioms for divine power manifesting in the world. In Egyptian religious language, divine intervention was often described through metaphors of hands, arms, or fingers to indicate the exertion of a deity's will. When the priests use such terminology, they are not simply admitting defeat. They are interpreting the event through a theological lens familiar to their own tradition. This acknowledgement carries enormous weight. It reveals that those most intimately familiar with Egypt's sacred traditions recognize an external divine force at work. Yet Pharaoh refuses to accept their interpretation. His perspective remains rooted in political necessity and national identity. Ancient kings were burdened not only with maintaining order, but with embodying it. To yield to another deity's authority would threaten the ideological foundation of Egyptian kingship. Thus, he maintains his stance, despite growing signs that the crisis is not merely environmental, but spiritual. The gnats continue to torment the nation, and with them comes a subtle shift in public perception. People who relied on priests for spiritual guidance see them unable to restore balance. Households where rituals once created a sense of protection now face relentless discomfort. Farmers tending fields find both themselves and their animals plagued by insects that sap strength and disrupt labor. Texts from agrarian societies describe infestations as threats to survival, particularly when combined with other ecological stressors. Egypt, already weakened by the earlier disruptions of the Nile and by the overwhelming presence of frogs, now faced yet another blow to its stability. In this context, the plagues do not appear as isolated incidents, but as a layered dismantling of Egypt's religious, economic, and psychological foundations. Each event touches a different domain: water, fertility, purity, revealing vulnerabilities that had long been masked by Egypt's confidence in its gods and its king. The plagues strike not at random, but at the core structures that gave Egypt its identity. For the Israelites observing these events, the situation carried a very different meaning. They were not participating in rebellion or insurrection. They watched a transformation of their environment that affirmed the presence and authority of the God who had spoken through Moses. The developing pattern of selective impact, one that would become clearer in later plagues, would have deepened their sense of belonging to a divine plan unfolding before them. The narrative does not describe them as triumphant or joyful. Rather, they witness events that redefine the relationship between their suffering and their future. As Egypt struggles under the weight of the gnats, a larger question emerges. What does it mean for an empire to face forces that neither political power nor religious tradition can contain? The plagues challenge not only the authority of Pharaoh, but the structure of reality as Egyptians understood it. In this sense, the narrative is not merely recounting ancient events, but exploring how societies interpret catastrophe, divine will, and the limits of human control. By the time the third plague subsides, Egypt stands at a crossroads. Its religious leaders have acknowledged divine intervention. Its ruler remains defiant. Its people suffer under repeated disruptions that strike at essential aspects of daily life. And in the midst of it all, a group of enslaved laborers, long considered insignificant within the machinery of empire, stand on the threshold of a transformation that will redefine them as a people. What began with water and continued with creatures of the river and the dust has become something far greater. Egypt is facing not a series of misfortunes, but a systematic unraveling of the assumptions that sustained its world. And yet, the most destabilizing events are still to come. Events that will move beyond irritation and disruption into realms that threaten the very structure of Egyptian society. When the gnats finally ceased and Egypt regained a moment of breath, the nation found itself more unsettled than it had been after either of the first two plagues. The Nile had recovered, the frogs had died off, and the gnats, though gone, had left behind a memory that lingered in the collective consciousness of a people who depended on ritual purity for their religious identity. Egypt had always prided itself on its ability to interpret and respond to divine messages through its priesthood. But now, after repeated failures, the confidence of both temple and throne had begun to fracture. The plagues were becoming not only physical afflictions, but revelations of vulnerability in a society that believed itself protected by unshakable cosmic order. It is at this point that the biblical narrative introduces the plague of swarms. The Hebrew terminology is debated among scholars. Some interpret it as flies. Others suggest mixed or wild creatures. Ancient translations like the Septuagint describe them as dogfly swarms, biting insects known to torment both humans and animals in Egypt's hot climate. Regardless of the precise species, the episode describes an overwhelming invasion that spreads throughout Egyptian homes and public spaces. What makes this plague distinctive is not merely the discomfort it brings, but the unprecedented distinction it draws between the Israelites and the Egyptians. For the first time, the text explicitly states that the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, remained untouched. This detail carries profound significance in ancient thought. Natural disasters rarely respect political boundaries, and ecological events typically spread across contiguous regions. Yet here, the narrative describes a separation so sharp that it demands theological interpretation. Egypt, which had long considered itself the center of divine favor, now found the boundaries of divine protection shifted. A marginalized foreign community was spared while the kingdom of Pharaoh suffered. For Egyptians accustomed to understanding the world through sacred geography, this inversion would have been deeply disorienting. Archaeological evidence indicates that Egypt often experienced outbreaks of biting insects during times of ecological imbalance. Such swarms could devastate livestock, spread disease, and interfere with daily labor. Texts from the Ramesside period record prayers against insects that invaded temples and desecrated offerings. Yet none of these accounts describe selective impacts between different populations living within the same region. The biblical description, therefore, goes beyond natural phenomenon and enters the realm of theological sign. A force capable of distinguishing between two groups living side by side was asserting its authority over the fabric of the land. From Pharaoh's perspective, this distinction posed a threat more severe than the physical discomfort of the plague. If the God of Israel could shield his people from an ecological crisis while allowing Egypt to suffer, then the underlying structure of Egyptian cosmic belief was being directly contradicted. Pharaoh, whose responsibility was to maintain order on behalf of the gods, now faced evidence suggesting that a foreign deity had overridden that mandate. Ancient kings relied heavily on signs and omens to measure divine favor. A split like this, in which one community thrived while another struggled, would have been an unmistakable declaration that Egypt's gods were unable to defend their own territory. The narrative shows Pharaoh responding with negotiation. He offers a partial concession. The Israelites may sacrifice, but only within Egypt. This proposal reflects typical Egyptian administrative strategies. Authorities often attempted to control foreign religious practices by regulating the locations where they could be performed. Allowing the Israelites to sacrifice within Egypt would grant Pharaoh the appearance of cooperation while maintaining his jurisdiction over their worship. But Moses rejects the offer, explaining that the sacrifices required would be offensive to Egyptian religious sensibilities and could provoke conflict. This exchange reveals the tensions between political compromise and religious identity. Pharaoh seeks to accommodate without conceding authority. Moses insists on obedience to a divine command that transcends political boundaries. When Pharaoh refuses once more, the swarms intensify. The text does not describe death or widespread destruction, but instead focuses on disruption. Daily life becoming unbearable, sacred spaces contaminated, administrative tasks hindered, and economic activity threatened. Officials who once carried out Pharaoh's orders with unquestioned loyalty now found themselves unable to maintain basic functions of governance. The plague exposed the fragility of an empire dependent on labor stability, agricultural upkeep, and ritual continuity. As suddenly as the plague arrives, it also ends, according to the timing Moses declares. This repetition of precise cessation reinforces the pattern already established with the frogs. The plagues do not follow natural cycles but operate according to command. For Egyptians accustomed to interpreting ecological events through seasonal rhythms, this controlled pattern would have violated familiar expectations. When the swarms finally dissipated, the relief was immediate but uneasy. People cleaned their homes, repaired damage, and attempted to restore normal routines. Yet the psychological impact remained. Egypt was no longer confronting mere disturbances. It was facing deliberate interventions. Once the swarms receded, the narrative shifts to a far more severe threat, a plague targeting livestock. Cattle and other domestic animals were central to Egypt's agricultural economy, religious symbolism, and social stability. Tomb paintings depict cattle herds as signs of wealth and prosperity. Bulls symbolized strength and divine vitality, associated with gods such as Ta and Montu. Even the Apis bull, considered a manifestation of divinity, was revered as a living symbol of sacred power. Thus, the death of livestock would not simply reduce economic productivity. It would undermine theological structures and social confidence. The biblical text emphasizes that the livestock plague affects only Egyptian animals, sparing those belonging to the Israelites. Like the previous plague, this distinction reinforces the theological narrative. The God of Israel exerts selective authority. Modern scholars note that diseases such as murrain and anthrax can spread rapidly among ungulates, especially following ecological disruptions like polluted water or mass die-offs of amphibians. Yet, no recorded outbreak in the ancient world demonstrates perfect geographic or ethnic differentiation. The distinction, therefore, is central to the message of the narrative. For Egyptians, the loss of livestock would have produced widespread mourning and economic instability. oxen used for plowing, donkeys used for transport, flocks that supplied wool, milk, and meat, all fell in numbers that shook the agricultural foundation of the country. Priests who tended sacred animals would have interpreted this as an attack on divine symbols themselves. Inscriptions describing the death of sacred bulls, record national grief, and elaborate rituals meant to restore balance. But here, the Egyptian gods offered no protection. The animals died without warning and without remedy. Pharaoh sends investigators to verify whether the Israelites' livestock has indeed been spared. This detail reflects the administrative precision of ancient Egyptian governance. The monarchy relied on scribes, inspectors, and messengers to manage agricultural production and religious oversight. The acknowledgement that Israelite herds remained intact would have carried tremendous weight. It revealed that the crises affecting Egypt did not arise from generalized environmental collapse, but from a force discriminating between populations. For Pharaoh, this moment served as yet another challenge to his role as guardian of the land. Yet the narrative states he hardened his heart, refusing to yield. The image of Pharaoh's hardened heart has long been interpreted through theological debate, but in the ancient Near Eastern context, it reflects a ruler struggling to preserve sovereignty in the face of signs that exceed his authority. Kings of the region frequently interpreted misfortune as an attack on their legitimacy. A ruler who conceded too easily risked appearing weak before both his subjects and his gods. Pharaoh's resistance thus emerges from the intersection of political survival, national pride, and theological denial. With Egypt reeling from the loss of its livestock, the next plague compounds the crisis through direct human suffering. Ash thrown into the air becomes dust that produces painful boils on people and animals. In the ancient world, skin diseases were among the most feared afflictions, not only for their pain, but for their implications regarding ritual purity. Egyptian medical texts from the Abers and Edwin Smith papyri detail treatments for various skin conditions and emphasize the spiritual dimensions of illness. A person afflicted with visible disease was often barred from participating in religious ceremonies. If priests became infected, entire temple operations could be disrupted. The narrative explicitly highlights that the priests and magicians, those who previously attempted to replicate or counteract earlier plagues, could not stand before Moses because of their affliction. This imagery symbolizes more than physical weakness. It represents the collapse of the religious authority that upheld Egypt's cosmic order. When those responsible for interpreting divine messages become incapacitated, a kingdom's spiritual foundation crumbles. From a historical perspective, diseases spreading among both humans and animals often follow ecological disruption, especially when previous disasters have weakened sanitation systems and altered environmental balances. But again, the biblical narrative differentiates itself through emphasis on timing, intensity, and theological significance. The affliction strikes those who once claimed insight into the divine realm, serving as a sign that human attempts to resist the unfolding events have reached their limits. Egypt, by this stage, is depicted as a nation besieged on multiple fronts. Economic structures falter as livestock die. Religious institutions fail as priests become impure. Political authority weakens as Pharaoh's decisions repeatedly lead to escalating crises. The Israelites observe this unraveling from the periphery, not as active participants, but as witnesses to the breakdown of a system that once seemed immovable. And yet, the narrative remains clear. The plagues are not designed merely to punish, but to reveal. They expose assumptions, challenge hierarchies, and force recognition of a divine authority that transcends national boundaries. Each plague touches a different layer of Egypt's identity, peeling back the veneer of stability to reveal how deeply dependent the nation was on its religious worldview. Water, fertility, purity, labor, agriculture, every sphere has been shaken. As Egypt suffers under the boils, a sobering truth emerges. The plagues are not misfortunes that can be explained through familiar patterns of nature, nor are they random acts of destruction. They form a coherent sequence, each event deepening the spiritual and psychological impact on Egypt while elevating the status of the Israelites as a people under divine protection. The narrative invites its audience to see not merely calamity, but a transformation of the world's moral and theological landscape. This brings Egypt to a pivotal moment. The land has experienced disruption, economic loss, and human suffering. Yet, the most devastating events still lie ahead, events that will touch the sky, the fields, and the very rhythm of life in ways that neither priest nor king could ever have anticipated. What began with water has now reached into the lives of humans and animals alike, and the path forward leads into even more profound confrontations between divine purpose and imperial power. The suffering caused by the boils eventually eased, but Egypt emerged from the plague profoundly changed. Physical wounds heal, yet the psychological scars left by events that upend one's understanding of the world remain long after the visible signs disappear. For a society whose stability depended on the seamless cooperation between natural cycles, political authority, and divine favor, the collapse of priestly purity and the affliction of sacred officials represented a deep fracture. Ritual life, which had once been the heartbeat of Egyptian identity, could no longer maintain its rhythm. Temples still stood, but the assurance that offerings, recitations, and ceremonies could restore cosmic balance no longer carried the certainty it once did. Into this fragile moment enters the next stage of the narrative, a devastating storm unlike anything Egypt had recorded in its long history. The text describes thunder, fire, and hail falling with a violence that shattered crops, broke trees, and left fields in ruin. Egypt, with its predictable seasons and minimal rainfall, rarely experienced severe storms, and its agricultural system was not built to withstand them. The appearance of hail, particularly of destructive size, would have been shocking to a people whose climate typically shielded them from such threats. Ancient Egyptian inscriptions provide some insight into how unusual weather was interpreted. Whenever significant storms occurred, scribes wrote of them as acts of gods whose anger disrupted the harmony of the land. One text from the Ramesside period describes a storm so fierce it toppled monuments and tore roofs from structures, attributing the event to divine conflict. Yet even in these accounts, storms remained anomalies that triggered ritual responses meant to restore order. The storm described in the biblical narrative exceeds these rare examples in both intensity and theological impact. Before the storm arrived, Moses conveyed a warning that framed the event in a way Egypt could not ignore. Officials who feared the consequences took shelter and protected their livestock and servants indoors, while those who dismissed the message left them exposed. This distinction reveals how the plagues began to influence individual decision-making within Egyptian society. No longer were the events interpreted exclusively through national leadership. Ordinary people now faced choices that reflected their own recognition or denial of the divine authority behind the unfolding crisis. When the storm struck, it tore through the land with devastating force. Fields that had begun to recover from earlier afflictions were crushed under sheets of ice. Flax and barley, crops central to Egypt's textile and brewing industries, were destroyed. The damage extended from agricultural wealth to social stability. Harvests affected not only food supply but trade, employment, and taxation. In a society where the state collected grain as a form of tribute and distributed portions to its laborers and officials, the collapse of crops threatened to destabilize the entire economic system. Hailstorms in the ancient Near East often carried symbolic meaning. The phenomenon was associated with the power of storm deities, Baal in Canaan, Adad in Mesopotamia, gods perceived as capable of unleashing both life-giving rain and destructive storms. Egypt, however, did not center its theology around a storm god. Its deities were linked to the sun, sky, fertility, and the Nile. Thus, the sudden appearance of a destructive storm challenged Egypt with a divine expression unfamiliar to its religious vocabulary. A force outside the realm of its traditional gods was asserting control over its climate. The storm's intensity created conditions that exposed the vulnerability of human labor. Workers tending fields, storing grain, or herding animals were caught in an environment that offered little protection. Structures not built for severe weather provided inadequate shelter. Even in royal estates, where resources allowed for sturdier buildings, the hail caused damage. It was a reminder that Egypt's sense of invulnerability was tied to predictable natural rhythms now shattered. Pharaoh's reaction to the storm reveals another shift in the narrative. He confesses wrongdoing and acknowledges the power of the God represented by Moses. This admission, though temporary, reflects a moment of clarity born from overwhelming circumstances. Ancient kings rarely admitted error, as such statements could undermine their position as custodians of cosmic order. Yet Pharaoh, confronted with devastation, speaks words he might previously have considered unthinkable. His confession carries the weight of both desperation and recognition, illustrating how deeply the plagues were reshaping perceptions of divine-human relationships. When Moses prays, the storm ceases. This deliberate end reinforces the pattern that differentiates these events from natural disasters. In ancient thought, storms passed according to the will of gods who acted independently of human requests. The cessation of the storm upon Moses' petition would have been interpreted as a sign that the God of Israel operated not through chaotic impulse, but through purposeful intervention. Yet, despite witnessing this controlled sequence, Pharaoh retracts his admission once the threat lifts. This reaction aligns with behavioral patterns documented in ancient sources. When crisis dissipates, rulers often interpret the end of danger as a sign that their authority remains intact. But Egypt was not returning to a state of stability. The hailstorm left behind fields stripped of crops and trees shattered to splinters. Such destruction affected more than a single year's harvest. It disrupted long-term agricultural cycles. Palm trees, sycamores, and other important resources for wood and food were damaged. The loss of flax threatened clothing production and trade relations. Barley used for bread and beer, the staples of Egyptian diet, was ruined. Even if wheat, which ripens later, survived, the economic impact of lost flax and barley would ripple through every level of society. Into this altered landscape came the next blow: locusts. Locust swarms were well known in the ancient Near East, feared for their ability to consume entire fields in hours. Egyptian inscriptions describe locust plagues as manifestations of divine anger or cosmic imbalance. One text portrays a swarm so large it darkened the sky and stripped fields bare. But even the most dramatic recorded swarms pale in comparison to the scale presented in the biblical narrative. The locusts appear after a warning, offering Pharaoh another opportunity to avert the crisis. His officials now openly plead with him, asking how long Egypt must endure suffering for the sake of refusing Israel's request. This internal pressure reveals that leadership unity has fractured. In autocratic systems, visible dissent among advisors signals profound instability. Egypt was now experiencing political erosion alongside ecological devastation and religious crisis. Pharaoh attempts a compromise, proposing that only the men of Israel may depart to worship. Moses rejects the condition, stressing that worship involves the entire community. This exchange highlights the differing understandings of religious obligation. In Egypt, temple rituals were often performed by designated specialists. Full communal participation was not always required. But Israel's religious identity was communal by nature, rooted in shared covenant practices. Pharaoh's compromise, therefore, misinterprets the essence of Israel's worship. When the locusts arrive, they exceed every recorded swarm in Egypt's history. The narrative emphasizes their unprecedented density and destructive power. They consume what little vegetation remained after the hail, including the wheat and spelt that had survived. In an agrarian society reliant on predictable cycles, the total destruction of crops meant not only immediate famine, but long-term scarcity. Grain stores from previous years would have been insufficient to counter such extensive loss. The threat of widespread hunger loomed over cities and villages alike. Ancient Egyptian texts often describe famine as a breakdown of moral and cosmic order. When food became scarce, social hierarchies strained under the pressure of unequal distribution. Laborers suffered while elites attempted to secure their own supplies. The memory of past famines haunted Egyptian consciousness, preserved in inscriptions that described chaos and violence accompanying economic collapse. The locust swarm thus struck at the heart of Egypt's most fundamental fear, a return to the disorder that their society existed to prevent. Pharaoh, overwhelmed by the destruction, calls Moses and Aaron and confesses again. His plea combines both acknowledgement of wrongdoing and urgency for relief. Yet, once more, the cessation of the plague upon Moses' request is followed by Pharaoh's return to resistance. This cycle reveals a tension that modern readers sometimes overlook. Pharaoh's decisions were shaped not only by personal stubbornness, but by the political structure he represented. Conceding to Moses would undermine his role as guardian of Egypt's order, and thus he responds to temporary relief by reasserting authority. But Egypt's land was now nearly bare. The landscape that once symbolized abundance had been stripped to its roots. Farms, orchards, and groves lay desolate. What little vegetation remained stood as a reminder of the forces beyond Egypt's control. The people, who relied on their king to maintain harmony through the gods, now saw a world where harmony had been replaced by uncertainty. Rituals continued, but the assurances they once provided no longer carried the same conviction. The next event plunges Egypt into an even deeper crisis, a darkness described as thick, oppressive, and tangible. Darkness in the ancient Near East carried profound symbolic meaning. It represented uncreation, the collapse of order into primordial chaos. Egyptian theology placed immense importance on light, because the sun god Ra's daily journey embodied stability. Each sunrise reaffirmed Pharaoh's ability to maintain cosmic balance. When darkness engulfed Egypt for days, it struck at the symbolic core of the kingdom's worldview. The narrative describes people unable to see one another or move from their places. This paralysis reflects psychological terror as much as physical limitation. In societies where daylight structured every aspect of life, from work schedules to religious ceremonies, prolonged darkness would have disrupted not only labor, but the very perception of time. Temples that relied on sunlight to illuminate sacred spaces would have been plunged into gloom, interrupting crucial rituals. Yet, once again, the distinction appears. Israel dwells in light. The theological message is unmistakable. The God of Israel controls forces that Egypt associates with divine kingship itself. The sun, the most powerful symbol of Pharaoh's authority, fails to shine. For Egyptians, this would not be interpreted merely as an environmental anomaly, but as a direct challenge to the cosmic system that upheld their society. Pharaoh summons Moses once more and offers another partial concession. This time, he permits the people to leave, but demands that their livestock remain. Such a demand reflects Egypt's economic desperation. Livestock had already been decimated, and Pharaoh was unwilling to release what remained. Moses refuses, asserting that worship requires offerings. The negotiation reveals the incompatible aims of the two sides. Pharaoh seeks to maintain control and salvage Egypt's economy. Moses insists on obedience to divine instruction. The darkness lifts only after its purpose is fulfilled. Yet Pharaoh's response hardens further. His refusal now becomes personal, expressed with hostility. The relationship between king and prophet has deteriorated into open antagonism. Egypt teeters on a precipice, trapped between national pride and the undeniable evidence of divine power. The plagues have dismantled Egypt's confidence in its fertility, purity, stability, and cosmology. Yet, the narrative shows that deeper consequences still lie ahead, not through introduction of new afflictions, but through the culmination of everything that has been building. By this stage, Egypt is a nation stripped of its agricultural wealth, weakened by disease, overwhelmed by insects, traumatized by storms, and plunged into metaphysical terror through darkness. Its economy, its religion, and its political structures have all been tested. The social fabric is frayed, families face scarcity, temples stand in quiet desperation, farmers look upon barren fields, officials whisper in private councils, unsure how to advise their king. The story has reached a point where Egypt's identity, so long anchored in the assumption that its God sustained it, has been shaken to its core. Yet even in this weakened state, Pharaoh holds fast to a vision of power that cannot yield. His resistance is no longer simply a political stance. It is a struggle to preserve a world that is unraveling before him. Egypt stood in a fragile dusk after the darkness ended, its people still recovering from days in which time itself had seemed to collapse. Few experiences can reshape a society as thoroughly as losing the natural rhythms upon which life depends. Farmers no longer trusted the sky. Priests no longer trusted their rituals. Families no longer trusted the order they had always believed was guaranteed by the gods and upheld by their king. The land had endured calamities of water, soil, sky, and flesh, each one chipping away at Egypt's confidence in its own worldview. Yet, beneath these external events lay a deeper transformation. The kingdom's spiritual foundation had begun to fracture from within. In ancient civilizations, crises of this magnitude often produced a series of cascading effects. When people feared that divine order had been disrupted, they reassessed their loyalties, questioned inherited traditions, and searched for signs of meaning in the chaos. The plagues had not merely attacked Egypt's environment, they had destabilized its religious imagination. What had once been unquestioned assumptions were now open to doubt. The priests, once seen as intermediaries between the gods and the people, had been rendered powerless by both impurity and sickness. The sun god had failed to rise. Sacred animals had died. Symbols of fertility had turned against the land. Egypt's theological vocabulary no longer explained the world unfolding around it. Meanwhile, the Israelites, though observers rather than instigators, were being reshaped in their own way. Their understanding of the God who called them was deepening. For generations, they had lived under forced labor, shaped by the structures of a foreign empire. Their identity had been tied to survival, endurance, and memory of ancient promises. But now they witnessed a sequence of events that placed their God at the center of cosmic conflict. Their task was not to fight for freedom, but to prepare for a transformation that extended far beyond liberation. From physical bondage, they were being drawn into a narrative in which divine justice, human suffering, and the reordering of nations converged. This convergence sets the stage for one of the most solemn and theologically dense moments in the entire account, the institution of a ritual that would define Israel's identity for millennia. Before the final and most devastating plague occurs, the narrative pauses to introduce the Passover, framing it not merely as a response to crisis, but as a foundational act that establishes a new relationship between the people and their God. In the midst of Egypt's unraveling, Israel is instructed to mark its homes, prepare a specific meal, and participate in a night of remembrance. The details of this ritual are steeped in symbolism. The selection of a lamb without blemish reflects purity and offering. The marking of door frames represents protection and separation. The shared meal signifies unity and continuity. Ancient Near Eastern cultures frequently used ritual meals to establish covenants, affirm communal identity, and commemorate decisive moments. Here, the meal becomes a boundary between life and death, between judgment and mercy. It is not simply a ceremony, but an act of obedience in anticipation of an event that will reshape the fate of both Israel and Egypt. Egypt, meanwhile, remains unaware of the full significance of what is about to unfold. The kingdom has witnessed 9 distinct manifestations of divine power, each escalating in severity and symbolic force. Yet Pharaoh continues to resist the command that would allow Israel to depart. His resistance is often interpreted as obstinacy, but within the ancient context, it reflects a deeper concern. Releasing the Israelites would signal submission to a foreign deity. Such a concession would challenge the legitimacy of Pharaoh's rule, undermine the ideological cohesion of Egypt, and suggest that the gods could not protect their own domain. Political power in ancient Egypt depended not merely on armies and taxation, but on the perception that Pharaoh embodied the will of the gods. To admit defeat in a theological contest would weaken his authority. Even as the nation lay weakened, Pharaoh's internal logic remained consistent with the worldview of kingship that shaped his entire life. Yet, this logic collided with events that exposed its limits. Egypt's gods had been silent, its priests had been powerless, its rituals had failed. Still, Pharaoh held to the belief that his authority could not yield to a divine claim originating outside Egypt's cosmic order. As Israel prepared for the night ahead, the narrative turns its attention toward Egypt's ancient fear, the vulnerability of the firstborn. Across the Near East, the firstborn carried symbolic weight. They represented lineage, inheritance, continuity, and the very future of a household. Egyptian inscriptions emphasize the protective care given to firstborn sons who often inherited titles, land, or priestly roles. The death of a firstborn was considered a sign of extraordinary misfortune, one that indicated divine displeasure or a rupture in cosmic balance. Thus, the announcement of a coming plague targeting the firstborn would have struck at the psychological core of Egyptian identity. The biblical text frames this event not as arbitrary destruction, but as the culmination of a long-standing struggle between oppression and liberation, between competing understandings of divine authority. Throughout the narrative, the plagues have been described as signs, judgments, and revelations, not acts of chaotic violence, but interventions that expose moral and spiritual realities. In this context, the death of the firstborn is portrayed as the final consequence of Pharaoh's refusal to recognize a boundary that no earthly ruler is permitted to cross, the boundary separating human sovereignty from divine will. For Egypt, the night approaches with no awareness of the rituals unfolding in Goshen. Households prepare for rest. Officials attempt to restore order. Priests recite prayers in temples that have grown eerily quiet. Families exhausted from weeks of calamity seek comfort in familiar routines. Even Pharaoh, though troubled, likely believed that the worst had passed. Darkness had lifted. The sky was clear. No visible sign warned of what was coming. In Israelite homes, however, the atmosphere is different. The people gather together, carrying out instructions with solemn precision. The marking of doorframes stands as a visible sign of belonging and obedience. The meal is eaten in readiness, not leisure. What happens next is described with brevity in the text, yet its impact reverberates through centuries of religious memory. The event is shrouded in a solemnity that defies full description, emphasizing the gravity of divine judgment and the weight of liberation. In the middle of the night, a cry rises across Egypt, a sound unlike anything the nation has ever known. The death of the firstborn cuts across every social class, from the household of Pharaoh to the home of the prisoner. It touches noble estates and modest dwellings alike. The universality of the tragedy communicates a profound theological message. No earthly hierarchy can shield against divine justice. The structures that Egypt relied upon, birth order, privilege, wealth, lineage, offer no protection. The texts of the ancient world often describe communal grief through the metaphor of a city wailing as one voice. Egypt, in this moment, becomes such a city. The scale of loss defies ordinary mourning practices. Families who once took pride in their firstborn now face the abrupt collapse of future hopes. The nightly rhythm of the kingdom gives way to anguish that sweeps through every district. It is grief on a scale that dissolves boundaries between the powerful and the powerless. Pharaoh's reaction reflects the shattering of the role he once embodied. The king who had resisted Moses through 9 plagues now confronts a reality in which his authority has no meaning. His own household is struck. The cosmic balance he was meant to uphold lies in ruins. He summons Moses and Aaron not to negotiate or compromise, but to demand that Israel leave immediately. The urgency reflects the collapse of everything he once believed gave him strength. In Israelite homes, the night is marked by silence rather than chaos. The ritual of Passover creates an atmosphere of solemn obedience. Families eat together, prepared to leave at a moment's notice. The distinction between Egypt and Israel is once again visible, not through environmental phenomena, but through the contrasting soundscapes of the night. Cries of grief in Egyptian streets and quiet readiness among the Israelites. The departure that follows is not chaotic flight, but purposeful movement. Israel leaves as a people bound by shared memory, shared suffering, and shared identity. They carry with them not only their possessions, but the weight of a story that will define them for generations. They move through a land marked by devastation, past homes where mourning has only begun. The moment is both liberation and revelation. Liberation from physical bondage and revelation of a God who reshapes history. For Egypt, the aftermath brings a different set of realities. The loss of the firstborn threatens succession lines, disrupts inheritance structures, and destabilizes households. Priestly families face the collapse of traditional roles. Government officials must grapple with administrative chaos. Communities accustomed to stability confront a landscape transformed by loss, famine, disease, and death. The foundation of Egyptian identity, its gods, its king, its cosmic order, has been shaken beyond recognition. And yet, the narrative does not portray Egypt as merely a defeated nation. It presents it as a kingdom forced to realize the limits of its power in the face of divine sovereignty. The plagues have revealed not only the might of the God of Israel, but the fragility of the systems upon which Egypt built its identity. The experience leaves the nation in a state of profound reconsideration. Inscriptions from later periods show that Egypt interpreted foreign crises as cosmic threats, requiring renewed ritual devotion. But none of those records describe anything comparable to the scale of what is presented here. Israel now faces a new question. How does a people who has lived for generations under oppression learn to walk in freedom? Their departure marks the beginning of a journey that will test their resilience, faith, and identity. The plagues have changed them, just as they have changed Egypt. They will carry the memory of this night throughout their history, recalling both the weight of judgment and the depth of mercy. Egypt, too, enters a different chapter. The funerary customs that once comforted families now struggle to absorb the magnitude of loss. Temples attempt to restore rituals disrupted by sickness, insects, and darkness. The economy, already weakened by destroyed crops and dying livestock, must respond to the sudden void left by the death of heirs. And Pharaoh, the embodiment of cosmic order, now stands as a symbol of a reality he no longer controls. The events of the night create a chasm between what Egypt was and what it is now. Across the land, people awaken to a world that no longer reflects the stability they once knew. Every household touched by loss becomes a reminder that divine authority has spoken in a way that transcends human power. And Israel, walking away from the land of their captivity, steps into a future shaped not by empire, but by covenant. The night of the final plague left Egypt suspended between shock and silence. Dawn did not bring renewal. It brought the realization that a kingdom built on order, lineage, and divine favor had been stripped of the very foundations that sustained its confidence. The cries that rose across the land had quieted, but the memory of them lingered in every courtyard, every marketplace, and every estate. Entire households faced an emptiness that could not be measured by material loss. A society that prided itself on preserving tradition through generations had suddenly lost its heirs. The firstborn, symbols of continuity, inheritance, and future leadership, were gone. In that same morning, another sight defined the landscape. The Israelites preparing to leave. The instructions given to them required speed and readiness. And now they gathered possessions, tools, livestock, and provisions, forming caravans that stretched across the horizon. Egypt had known migration before: traders, nomadic groups, officials sent abroad for imperial matters, but nothing like this. An entire population, once bound to labor under Egyptian rule, now moved with purpose toward a future no one in Egypt had foreseen. The departure stripped the land not only of human labor, but of the very people whose presence had structured Egyptian economic life for decades. The departure also carried profound symbolic meaning. Israel did not slip away in fear. They left under the weight of a command that challenged Egypt's spiritual order. Their departure was not merely a political event, but a theological rupture. A people long considered peripheral to Egypt's concerns had become central to the greatest crisis the kingdom had ever faced. Their leaving fulfilled a promise centuries old, a promise preserved through memory, even in the midst of enslavement. And for Egypt, it represented a moment when the trajectory of its national identity was forced into confrontation with a reality it could not contain. Before Israel fully exited the land, Egypt engaged in an act that reveals the depth of its fear and its desire to end the suffering. The narrative describes Egyptians giving the departing people gold, silver, and garments. In the ancient world, such offerings were expressions of appeasement or gestures intended to secure protection from further harm. They could also symbolize acknowledgement of divine favor resting on those who received the gifts. Egypt's wealth, once a symbol of its dominance, now became a means of urging Israel's departure. This inversion reflects the broader shift of power. The empire that had demanded labor and tribute now gave freely to those who had once been its servants. Israel's departure marks a turning point, not only for the community itself, but for the theological imagination of the ancient Near East. Empires often recorded their triumphs, portraying themselves as instruments of divine justice. But the narrative here presents a different kind of victory. A marginalized people liberated not by military revolt or political strategy, but by a sequence of events attributed to a higher authority. Their journey becomes a new lens through which nations would eventually interpret divine involvement in human affairs. Liberation becomes not just a social event, but a sacred one. Egypt, however, was not ready to release its claim so easily. The sudden departure of a massive labor force left the kingdom vulnerable. The economy, already weakened by ecological collapse, now faced a future without the workers who had maintained infrastructure, cultivated fields, and supported the system through which Egypt expanded its power. The departure of Israel represented not only the loss of manpower, but the unraveling of a long-standing hierarchy that benefited the elite. The shock Egypt experienced during the final plague now evolved into a desperate attempt to reclaim control. Pharaoh's pursuit of Israel has been the subject of extensive scholarly analysis. In the ancient world, kings who lost subject or territory often pursued fugitives to restore authority, prevent rebellion, or reassert dominance. For Pharaoh, this pursuit was not simply a strategic decision, but a final attempt to restore a cosmic order he believed had been disrupted. The plagues had demonstrated the limits of his authority, but the departure of Israel threatened to make those limits permanent. The pursuit thus reflects the tension between divine purpose and human resistance, between the collapse of an old world and the emergence of a new one. The narrative shifts to Israel's journey into the wilderness. The wilderness in ancient literature often represents places of testing, transition, or divine encounter. For Israel, it becomes the environment through which they must unlearn the mindset of slavery and adopt a new identity shaped by covenant. They carry with them the memory of the plagues and the experience of protection. Yet, they also face uncertainty. Freedom does not erase the psychological imprint of generations spent under oppression. The journey becomes a space in which Israel must confront both external challenges and internal fears. As Israel travels, another detail emerges. They take with them the bones of Joseph. This act holds deep significance. Joseph, once a high official in Egypt, had requested that his remains be carried to the land promised to his descendants. In ancient cultures, ancestral bones carried meaning far beyond physical remains. They symbolized identity, continuity, and belonging. By carrying Joseph's bones, Israel affirmed a connection to a history older than their life in Egypt. They were not simply leaving bondage. They were returning to a promise rooted in ancestral memory. This act reinforced the continuity of their story, even as they stepped into an uncertain future. Egypt's pursuit eventually leads to a confrontation at the edge of the sea, an event that has captured the imagination of readers, historians, and scholars for centuries. The geographical details have been debated extensively. Ancient bodies of water in the region included marshlands, lagoons, and seasonal lakes, any of which could have served as the setting. But the theological significance of the event transcends geography. It represents a boundary between captivity and liberation, between old identity and new purpose. When Israel stands before the water with Pharaoh's army approaching, they face their first major test of trust. The plagues had shown them divine power, but now they stood vulnerable, with no visible path forward. Their fear reflects the experience of a people who had not yet learned to walk in freedom. They still carried the reflexes of enslavement, responding to danger by doubting their future and questioning their leaders. This moment highlights a central theme of the narrative. Liberation does not instantly create confidence. It begins a process in which fear must be confronted through repeated experiences of deliverance. The next event, often described as the parting of the sea, has been interpreted in many ways. from natural phenomena such as wind-induced water shifts to purely supernatural intervention. What makes it significant in the narrative is not the mechanics, but the meaning. The sea in ancient symbolism represented chaos, danger, and the unknown. To pass through water on dry ground conveyed an image of creation emerging from chaos, order rising from disorder. Israel's passage becomes a renewal of identity, an echo of the ancient creation motifs in which dry land appears amid waters. For Egypt, the pursuit into the sea reflects both commitment to recapturing control and a profound misreading of the moment. The narrative portrays Egypt entering a space where divine purpose is unfolding in favor of Israel. Ancient texts frequently describe kings who, driven by pride or desperation, step into conflicts beyond their understanding. Pharaoh's army, equipped with chariots, weapons, and military training, represents the height of Egyptian power. Yet power based on human strength proves insufficient when confronted with a narrative shaped by divine intention. When the waters return and overwhelm the pursuing forces, the event marks a symbolic end to Egypt's attempt to maintain dominance over Israel. It represents the collapse of military power, the final expression of a conflict that began when Pharaoh dismissed the God of Israel as irrelevant to Egypt's cosmic order. The drowning of the army also carries historical echoes. Ancient inscriptions often describe armies defeated by natural disasters, floods, storms, or impassable terrain, interpreted as signs of divine judgment. Here, the destruction of the army signifies the end of a worldview that refused to recognize the boundaries of human power. Israel, standing on the far side of the sea, beholds a sight that cannot be forgotten. The people who had pursued them, who had enforced their labor, who had defined their life for generations, lay defeated not by their own hands, but through a power that reshaped their understanding of reality. This moment becomes the foundation for a new identity. No longer a community defined by oppression, they now see themselves as a people delivered through events that span nature, history, and theology. Yet, liberation brings new responsibilities. Once beyond the reach of Egyptian forces, Israel enters a landscape of scarcity. The wilderness challenges them with hunger, thirst, and uncertainty. Their reactions reveal that while they have experienced deliverance, they still struggle with trust. Freedom does not erase old fears, it exposes them. And so, the journey becomes a process of transformation. The people who once doubted their future now begin to learn dependence on a new kind of sustenance: manna, water from rocks, and guidance through space and time. Egypt, in the aftermath, faces a reality that is rarely described but can be inferred through historical and cultural context. The loss of its army further destabilizes a kingdom already shaken by ecological devastation, economic collapse, and widespread mourning. The plagues had targeted the structures that upheld Egypt's identity. The destruction of the army targeted its capacity to project power. For a nation that saw itself as the protector of order, the consequences were profound. Recovery would take years, perhaps generations. This psychological impact, the sense that cosmic order had been overturned, would linger. For Israel, the memory of the plagues becomes central to how they understand themselves and their God. The events are recorded, retold, and integrated into rituals that remind future generations of the night when divine justice reshaped history. Their journey through the wilderness becomes not only a physical movement, but a spiritual education. They carry forward a narrative in which liberation is inseparable from responsibility, in which divine power is inseparable from covenant and in which memory becomes a form of identity. Egypt and Israel now stand on opposite sides of a historical divide. One has lost its hold on a people it once dominated. The other has gained freedom at a cost that requires reflection, restructuring, and faith. The plagues, stretching from water to sky to the depths of human experience, have accomplished more than a change in political circumstance. They have revealed the fragile nature of human authority and the enduring force of divine purpose. Israel's escape from Egypt and the crossing of the sea did not end the story of the plagues. Rather, it opened the next phase of interpretation, a phase in which a newly freed people began to understand what these events meant for their identity, their faith, and their future. Liberation had come swiftly in historical terms, yet the internal transformation required for a community long shaped by oppression would unfold gradually. The wilderness, at first glance an obstacle, became the environment in which the meaning of the plagues deepened and the contours of a new national consciousness emerged. As the people moved away from the land that had shaped their lives for generations, they carried memories of its grandeur and its suffering. Egypt's imposing architecture, its ordered society, and its pervasive religious symbolism had left deep impressions. The plagues had not merely broken the physical hold of the empire, they had confronted and overturned the psychological and theological assumptions that Egypt imposed on those within its borders. The Israelites, accustomed to understanding power through the lens of Egyptian monarchy, now had to reorient their perspective. Their identity was no longer defined by the empire's structures, but by a covenantal relationship with the God who led them out. This transition was not smooth. Freed from pressure but accustomed to fear, the people often responded to scarcity with anxiety. Water sources were uncertain, food supplies dwindled, the wilderness exposed the fragility of their trust. In several episodes, the people expressed longing for Egypt, a longing not for bondage, but for predictability. This phenomenon is well attested in historical studies. Populations emerging from oppressive systems often struggle to adapt to freedom because stability, even under harsh conditions, offers a familiarity that uncertainty cannot match. The human heart gravitates toward the known, even when the known is painful. In this context, the plagues served a pedagogical purpose. They were not only acts of judgment against Egypt, they were formative experiences for Israel. The community had witnessed a sequence of events that revealed the limitations of imperial power and the presence of a divine authority operating outside the structures of any earthly kingdom. These memories became the foundation upon which Israel's identity could be rebuilt. They demonstrated that the God who called them was neither confined to a sacred place nor tied to natural forces, but acted with purpose across the landscape of history. This understanding becomes evident as the journey continues. The wilderness becomes a classroom where Israel learns disciplines that counter the habits formed under oppression. Daily provision, manna appearing in the morning, taught dependence rather than accumulation. Water emerging from unexpected places taught trust in divine guidance rather than reliance on predictable sources. These experiences linked back to the plagues in both structure and meaning. Just as the plagues had come in a sequence of escalating significance, the wilderness provisions came in patterns designed to form new rhythms in the community's consciousness. Meanwhile, Egypt, though absent from these wilderness scenes, continued to exist in the background of Israel's imagination. The kingdom from which they had come remained a reference point for understanding power, justice, suffering, and deliverance. The memory of Egypt served both as a warning and a testament, a warning of how empires can distort human identity, and a testament to how divine intervention can dismantle such distortions. In the retelling of the plagues, Israel did not present itself as the hero of the story, but as the recipient of a deliverance that reshaped the world they once knew. Archaeological findings across the Sinai Peninsula reveal how difficult the wilderness environment could be for ancient travelers. Water sources were sparse, vegetation limited, and temperatures extreme. Nomadic groups survived through intricate knowledge of terrain, seasonal movement, and careful resource management. Israel, however, was not a nomadic tribe accustomed to this lifestyle. They were a settled labor force, transitioning into a pastoral tribal identity under divine guidance. Their survival depended not on inherited knowledge, but on learning a new way of life shaped by trust in provisions they could not predict. This dependence reveals the psychological shift demanded of them. Under Egyptian bondage, their days were defined by external control and predictable hardship. Now, their days were defined by freedom and unpredictable provision. Scholars of human behavior note that unpredictability, even when benevolent, can be more frightening than predictable suffering because it requires surrendering control. The plagues, therefore, served as a bridge between two modes of existence: oppression under a human ruler and freedom under a divine one. As the community traveled further, they encountered hostile groups and unfamiliar terrains. Each encounter reinforced the contrast between Egypt's power, which they had once feared, and the new source of strength that guided them. The plagues had demonstrated that their God-controlled forces Egypt considered central to its identity: water, fertility, light, and life. Now, in the wilderness, that same authority operated in subtler, yet equally significant ways. Pillars of cloud and fire represented presence, movement, and guidance. These manifestations grounded Israel's experience of divine leadership, shifting their perception from awe in the face of miraculous judgment to assurance in the rhythm of daily provision. One of the most revealing episodes occurs when Israel reaches a place of bitter water. The people, overwhelmed by thirst, complain that they cannot drink it. Their reaction exposes how quickly fear can overshadow memory. They had witnessed the Nile turn to blood, frogs overwhelm the land, hail crash from the sky, and darkness descend over Egypt. Yet, standing before undrinkable water, they faltered. This moment illustrates a profound truth. Transformative events, even miraculous ones, do not instantly remove the patterns of thought shaped by long-term suffering. Human beings often revert to fear because fear is familiar. Yet, the response to their fear again reveals the continuity between the plagues and the wilderness journey. As Moses throws wood into the bitter waters and they become sweet, the narrative links divine intervention to the theme of transformation. Water, which in Egypt became an instrument of judgment, now becomes an instrument of provision. The same divine authority that reshaped Egypt's environment continues to shape Israel's. The plagues were not isolated events, but the beginning of a relationship that would redefine how Israel interpreted both suffering and deliverance. The giving of laws in the wilderness also reflects the significance of the plagues. In Egypt, laws and customs were enforced by earthly authority. Transgressions threatened social order, but rarely carried cosmic implications. In Israel's developing worldview, law was not merely social regulation, but covenantal expression. It served as the structure through which the people responded to the God who had acted on their behalf. The memory of the plagues gave weight to the commandments that would soon follow. These were not abstract principles, but instructions grounded in historical experience. As the community traveled, the memory of Egypt grew more complex. It became both a symbol of the oppression they had escaped and a source of nostalgia for predictability. This dual perception is common among groups emerging from long-term bondage. Sociological studies show that marginalized populations often struggle to internalize the idea of autonomy because their identities have been shaped by external control. Israel's ambivalence reflects this tension. The plagues had shattered Egypt's hold over them, but Egypt's imprint on their consciousness remained. This tension surfaces again in the episode of Manna. The people, confronted with hunger, express longing for the food they had in Egypt. Their memory selects the parts of their history that offered comfort, food security, even under oppressive conditions. It overlooks the suffering. This selective memory is not unique to Israel. It is a universal human response to uncertainty. The plagues had revealed divine power, but faith required more than observation. It required trust and provision that came each morning without guarantee for the next day. In Egypt, the plagues dismantled a world. In the wilderness, the same God who dismantled that world now built a new one. Each provision, each challenge, each moment of fear or gratitude contributed to the shaping of a community that would understand itself not through the lens of empire, but through the lens of covenant. The wilderness was a transformative space, a crucible in which identity, memory, and faith were refined. Meanwhile, Egypt's historical trajectory did not simply end with the destruction of its army. The kingdom continued to function, albeit weakened. Archaeological records indicate that Egypt remained a significant power for centuries, but the memory of a catastrophic event, interpreted in diverse ways across different texts, left traces in later literature. Some Egyptian writings describe periods of disorder, invasions, or divine displeasure, while these do not directly mirror the biblical account. They reflect a worldview in which cosmic imbalance was taken seriously. Whether or not Egyptians connected any specific crisis to the events described in the narrative, their cultural memory preserved the notion that divine judgment could reshape nations. For Israel, the plagues and the wilderness journey became inseparable parts of their foundational story. Later generations would recall these events during festivals, in prayers, and in teachings. The plagues were not remembered merely as punishments against Egypt, but as demonstrations of divine sovereignty and care for a vulnerable people. The memory shaped ethics, worship, and identity. The command to care for strangers, for example, was grounded in Israel's experience of being strangers in Egypt. The experience of deliverance became the moral foundation for compassion. Over time, the narrative of the plagues moved beyond historical recounting into liturgical expression. Songs and hymns celebrated deliverance. Rituals reenacted aspects of the story, embedding the memory into communal life. The Passover became the central moment through which Israel understood not only their past, but their relationship to God. The blood on the doorposts became a symbol of protection, obedience, and identity. The unleavened bread became a reminder of haste and readiness. These rituals ensured that the story would not fade as the generations passed. As Israel traveled deeper into the wilderness, they encountered new challenges that tested their emerging identity. But the plagues remained behind them as both memory and foundation. They were the proof that their God had intervened in history, not through abstract promises, but through tangible events that reshaped nations. The plagues had revealed the fragility of human authority, the limits of empire, and the depth of divine commitment. The wilderness journey would reveal the responsibilities of a people chosen not only for liberation, but for covenantal purpose. In this sense, the plagues were not merely acts of judgment. They were acts of formation. They dismantled Egypt's system, but they also dismantled Israel's internalized captivity. They prepared a people to receive laws, to build community, and to inhabit a future that required trust, discipline, and memory. The wilderness, therefore, was not an afterthought, but the logical next stage of transformation. It was the place where a newly freed people learned to live differently, interpret crisis differently, and understand themselves differently. The narrative invites its audience to see the plagues not as isolated episodes, but as part of a larger tapestry of divine human interaction. They reveal a God who confronts oppression, reshapes history, and forms identity through both power and provision. And as Israel continues its journey, the plagues remain a reference point, a reminder of the one who upended the structures of empire to create a new people capable of bearing a story that would endure through centuries. As Israel moved further into the wilderness, the memory of the plagues continued to shape their understanding of both past and present. What they had witnessed in Egypt remained the cornerstone of their identity. Yet, the wilderness required them to reinterpret that memory in new ways. Freedom had been granted, but freedom was not the end of the story, only the beginning of a long reshaping of how the people understood themselves, their God, and their future. The plagues were no longer just events they had seen. They were the lens through which they now encountered adversity, provision, law, and destiny. The wilderness exposed an enduring tension within the community. They remembered Egypt as a place of suffering, yet at moments of hardship they recalled it as a place of stability. This ambivalence reveals a truth recognized by historians and anthropologists alike. The transition from oppression to autonomy often awakens conflicting emotions. Under oppression, people develop coping strategies that create a sense of predictability. Under freedom, those strategies no longer apply, and the uncertainty feels threatening. Israel carried generations of learned responses to adversity, responses rooted in survival, under a regime that controlled every aspect of their lives. Now, with control removed, they faced a world where trust, rather than endurance, became the central requirement. The plagues had dismantled the oppressive power structure that held them, but they had not yet dismantled the internal fear shaped by that oppression. The wilderness journey brought this into the open. At places where water was scarce or food uncertain, the people responded not with confidence born from memory, but with anxiety rooted in past experiences. These reactions demonstrate that liberation is not merely external. It must also transform the internal landscape shaped by by long-term suffering. The plagues had shown them what their God could do. Now, they needed to learn what it meant to live in relationship with Him beyond moments of dramatic intervention. One of the earliest moments revealing this transformation occurs when the people gather manna, the mysterious sustenance that appears each morning. The instructions surrounding manna, that no one should store it overnight except before the day of rest, teach the community a form of trust that counters the survival instincts formed in Egypt. Under oppression, storing food was a way to protect oneself against scarcity. In the wilderness, storing food against divine instruction led to spoilage, demonstrating that the patterns which once ensured survival now impeded spiritual growth. The plagues had introduced Israel to a God who provides. Manna taught them to depend on that provision daily. This shift from survival to trust reflects a profound psychological change. The plagues had shown them the power of their God over nature, disease, and empire. But if the community continued to behave as though they lived under Egyptian authority, that memory would become incomplete, remembered only as a display of might rather than as an expression of covenant. Manna, water from the rock, and other wilderness provisions completed the lesson begun in Egypt. They demonstrated not only what God could do in moments of crisis, but what He would do in the daily rhythms of life. Meanwhile, Israel's understanding of Egypt also evolved. Egypt was no longer simply the land of their suffering. It became a symbol in their collective memory, representing both oppression and the dramatic intervention that brought them freedom. This dual memory shaped how they interpreted their own calling. If Egypt embodied the misuse of power, Israel was called to embody something different. If Egypt's order depended on forced labor and rigid hierarchy, Israel's emerging identity depended on covenantal equality, justice, and compassion. Later laws concerning the treatment of foreigners, laborers, widows, and orphans drew directly from Israel's own experience. Their suffering in Egypt became the moral foundation for empathy. At the foot of a mountain that would soon become the setting for a defining moment, the people camped in preparation for receiving a set of laws that would formalize their identity. The plagues had drawn a boundary around Israel, marking them as a distinct people protected by divine power. Now, that boundary would be filled with structure, ethics, and purpose. The laws were not arbitrary commands. They were responses to the experiences Israel had endured. Each instruction concerning justice, fairness, and communal responsibility reflected the contrast between life under Egypt and life under covenant. For instance, laws forbidding the mistreatment of foreigners stemmed directly from their own memory of being foreigners in Egypt. Regulations about rest reflected the contrast between forced labor and ordained rhythm. Instructions on debt, land, and servitude created safeguards against the emergence of systems resembling those that once enslaved them. In this sense, the plagues served not only as instruments of liberation, but as the foundation for a legal and ethical system designed to prevent future oppression. As Israel prepared to receive these laws, they were confronted with a manifestation of divine presence that recalled the awe and fear inspired by the plagues. Whereas the plagues displayed divine power against an empire, the events at the mountain displayed divine presence for a liberated people. The line between fear and reverence became a point of reflection. The plagues had elicited fear from Egypt. Now Israel experienced a reverence shaped by the same power, but directed toward relationship rather than judgment. This difference highlights another essential aspect of the narrative. Divine power is not monolithic. In Egypt, the plagues revealed a God who disrupts injustice. In the wilderness, the same God reveals a desire for communion, guidance, and instruction. The people who witnessed hail ruin fields and darkness cover the land now witnessed a presence that sought to shape them into a community grounded in moral responsibility. In this way, the plagues and the revelation that followed are inseparable. One tore down a system of oppression. The other built the ethical framework for a new society. The memory of the plagues also shaped Israel's understanding of leadership. In Egypt, leadership was embodied in a king whose authority rested on divine pretension and coercive power. In the wilderness, leadership was defined by service, humility, and responsibility before God. Moses became the antithesis of Pharaoh, not because he lacked authority, but because his authority came from obedience rather than dominion. His leadership style reflected the lessons of the plagues. True authority acknowledges divine sovereignty rather than claiming it. This contrast between Pharaoh and Moses would remain central to Israel's political theology. Later generations, in times of monarchy and exile, would look back on this moment to evaluate their own leaders. Prophets would invoke the memory of the plagues to remind kings that their power was conditional, grounded not in themselves, but in the covenant. Thus, the plagues became a perpetual standard against which all future authority would be measured. As Israel continued its journey, they encountered nations and landscapes shaped by different histories and beliefs. Each encounter deepened the contrast between their emerging identity and the world around them. The plagues had revealed a God who acted beyond the boundaries of empire. Now, Israel's task was to embody that revelation in how they lived. Their laws, worship, and community structure all stemmed from the experiences in Egypt. Even the practice of remembering the plagues became a formative ritual shaping each new generation. The annual Passover observance ensured that the memory would never fade. Each household retold the story, emphasizing not only the suffering of Egypt, but the mercy shown to Israel. In doing so, they reinforced a theological truth. Liberation is not a singular event, but a continual process shaped by memory. By remembering, they preserved their identity. By reenacting the ritual, they affirmed their belonging. And by teaching the story to their children, they ensured that the lessons of the plagues would not remain confined to history, but would serve as guidance for future decisions and challenges. This ritual memory created a cycle of identity formation that mirrored the rhythm of the wilderness provisions. Just as manna taught daily trust, Passover taught annual remembrance. Together, these rhythms prevented Israel from sliding back into the mindset of fear and dependency that had characterized their life in Egypt. The plagues were both a warning and a promise. A warning of what happens when human authority becomes oppressive, and a promise that divine justice intervenes on behalf of the vulnerable. Yet, memory alone could not erase the emotional complexities of Israel's past. At moments of fear, individuals still spoke nostalgically of Egypt, recalling the security of predictable suffering rather than facing the demands of uncertain freedom. This tension did not indicate disloyalty, but highlighted the human tendency to gravitate toward what is known. The wilderness journey brought these tendencies to the surface. allowing the community to confront and reshape them. The plagues had freed their bodies. The wilderness sought to free their minds and hearts. The narrative demonstrates that transformation is rarely instantaneous. It unfolds through struggle, provision, failure, and recovery. Israel learned to reinterpret challenges not as evidence of abandonment, but as opportunities to deepen trust. In this way, the plagues served as the foundation for a new kind of perception. They taught Israel to see beyond immediate circumstances and recognize the patterns of divine involvement woven into their history. Meanwhile, although the narrative does not dwell on Egypt after the sea, the implications of the plagues linger as a backdrop to the broader story. Egypt remained a significant power in the region, but its ideological framework would be forever altered in the memory of Israel. For Israel, Egypt became the archetype of oppression, a symbol used in prophetic writings to describe any system that imposed injustice, exploited the weak, or misused authority. The plagues thus transcended their immediate historical context and became theological symbols through which later generations interpreted their own experiences. This symbolic use did not erase the historical reality, but expanded it. The plagues continued to function as both memory and metaphor. Memory of what had happened, and metaphor for what happens whenever oppressive power encounters divine justice. This dual function ensured the story would retain relevance long after the specific events had faded into distant history. As the journey through the wilderness progressed, the people grew in their understanding of themselves as a community shaped by both judgment and mercy. The memory of Egypt remained a cautionary tale. The experience of provision became a sustaining truth. Together, they formed the basis of a worldview in which power is redefined, identity is renewed, and history becomes a vehicle for ethical transformation. By the time Israel drew closer to the land they had been promised, the plagues were no longer a distant event, but the foundation upon which their story rested. They had moved from fear to remembrance, from survival to trust, from identity shaped by empire to identity shaped by covenant. The plagues had changed them, not only by freeing them, but by revealing the kind of people they were called to become. As Israel journeyed deeper into the wilderness and began approaching regions long associated with their ancestors, the memory of Egypt continued to shape the way they understood their place in the world. Though the plagues were now behind them, their meaning grew rather than faded. Each new challenge, each new encounter brought the community back to the lessons embedded in those extraordinary events. The plagues had broken the power that held them, but they had also given them a new way to interpret reality, one in which divine justice, covenantal responsibility, and national identity were inseparable. The wilderness itself became a living commentary on the plagues. Harsh landscapes, limited resources, and the unpredictable conditions of nomadic life continually forced the people to remember the one who had brought them out. Egypt had been a place of abundance, distorted by oppression. The wilderness was a place of scarcity, shaped by purpose. In Egypt, suffering had come through human control. In the wilderness, hardship became a means of transformation. This contrast reframed the meaning of trust. In Egypt, trust had been impossible. In the wilderness, it became essential. The lessons of the plagues echoed throughout every stage of the wilderness experience. The plagues had dismantled the theology of empire. The wilderness would now establish the theology of covenant. This transition is evident in the giving of laws, the building of the tabernacle, and the formation of rituals that would define Israel for generations. The people were learning that the God who had overturned Egypt's structures of oppression now sought to shape a nation capable of reflecting justice, compassion, and holiness. The instructions for the tabernacle reveal this connection clearly. Egypt had been filled with massive stone temples designed to honor gods who were believed to inhabit specific spaces. These temples were built by forced labor, decorated with imagery, celebrating the power of the king, and maintained through strict systems of purity that often excluded the common people. The plagues had exposed the vulnerability of that system. Now, in the wilderness, Israel was commanded to build a very different kind of sacred space, one that emphasized accessibility, mobility, and presence. The tabernacle was not a monument of imperial strength, but a portable sanctuary carried by the community. It did not elevate a human king, but emphasized the presence of a divine one who moved with his people. Its structure required contributions from everyone, free will offerings of materials that they had received largely from Egypt. In this way, the wealth Egypt had given them at their departure became the foundation for the very place in which Israel would encounter their God. The plagues thus continued their transformative purpose. What had once been a symbol of oppression became a resource for worship. The rituals associated with the tabernacle also reflected lessons drawn from the plagues. Egypt's priesthood had been fragmented by impurity during the plagues. Israel's priesthood would need to embody a new kind of purity, rooted not in status, but in obedience. Detailed instructions for sacrifices, offerings, and purity laws taught the people that access to the divine required responsibility and reverence. The plagues had shown what happens when divine order is violated through oppression. The tabernacle taught what it meant to uphold divine order through faithful observance. Memory became central to this process. Israel was repeatedly commanded to remember the plagues, not as a means of vengeance, but as a means of understanding who they were. They were the people whom God had brought out with signs and wonders. That memory shaped their ethics. They were instructed not to oppress foreigners because they themselves had been oppressed in Egypt. They were told to rest on the seventh day because they had once been denied rest in Egypt. They were told to release debts and servants periodically because they themselves had been released from bondage. The plagues became the foundation for a society built on compassion, equality, and responsibility. Yet, memory is complex, and its influence is not always straightforward. While the plagues established Israel's identity in positive ways, they also became a source of fear during moments of crisis. When the people faced military threats or internal disputes, some began to question whether the God who had judged Egypt might also judge them for their failures. This fear is not irrational. The narrative presents God as one who intervenes decisively in history. The community understood that covenantal relationship brought blessings, but also accountability. The plagues had demonstrated both aspects, protection for the oppressed and judgment for the oppressor. This ambivalence becomes evident in episodes where the people rebel or express doubt, when they complain about food, when they distrust leadership, or when they question the path forward. They sometimes fear that their own missteps might result in divine anger. These episodes reflect a growing awareness of responsibility. Plagues had not simply freed them, they had revealed the character of their God, and that revelation carried weight. As the community matured, they learned to differentiate between legitimate fear of divine justice and the trust necessary to live in covenantal faithfulness. The wilderness journey tested this balance repeatedly. One of the most striking examples occurs when the people face a shortage of water and respond with accusation and anger. Such moments reveal a tension between memory and experience. The plagues had shown Israel that their God was capable of reshaping the natural world, yet scarcity in the wilderness awakened old fears shaped by years of oppression. The psychological shift required to move from fear-driven survival to trust-driven obedience was enormous. Yet each crisis became an opportunity for growth. Water flowed from unlikely places. Food appeared each morning. Protection came in battles they could not have won alone. Every provision reaffirmed that the same God who had acted decisively in Egypt continued to act in quieter but equally significant ways. Over time, the community's memory of the plagues deepened. They came to see the plagues not merely as dramatic events, but as the beginning of a relationship that defined their daily experience. Divine involvement did not end with the crossing of the sea. It continued in every step of their journey. Meanwhile, the memory of Egypt as a symbol of oppression developed into a broader theological category. Egypt became shorthand for any system that exploited human beings, elevated human rulers to divine status, or relied on violence to maintain order. Prophets in later generations would invoke Egypt to critique unjust practices within Israel itself, warning that the nation must not repeat the sins of its former oppressor. In this way, the plagues became a moral mirror in which Israel examined not only its past, but its ongoing responsibilities. They also became a framework for understanding divine intervention throughout history. When later communities faced threats, whether from invading armies, corrupt rulers, or internal decay, they recalled the plagues as evidence that oppression would not have the final word. The plagues thus served as a theological anchor, grounding hope in the memory of a God who intervened on behalf of the vulnerable. This hope was not simplistic optimism. It was rooted in a historical event that had reshaped nations. Even in the wilderness, this hope sustained Israel through seasons of uncertainty. When they entered lands with fortified cities, powerful armies, and unfamiliar gods, the memory of the plagues reminded them that human strength did not determine outcomes. When internal conflicts threatened unity, the memory reminded them that their identity was not self-created, but divinely forged. And when they doubted their ability to inherit the land promised to them, the plagues reminded them that the God who overcame Egypt could overcome any obstacle they faced. The plagues also influenced Israel's understanding of environmental and natural phenomena. In Egypt, natural cycles had been tied to the power of the gods. In Israel, the plagues taught that nature was neither divine nor random. It was subject to the will of the Creator. Rain, harvest, drought, and abundance were interpreted not as capricious acts of nature, but as elements within a moral and covenantal framework. This understanding shaped Israel's worship practices, agricultural festivals, and ethical commitments. The land they would eventually enter was not to be exploited as Egypt exploited its laborers. It was to be stewarded with justice and gratitude. As the people approached the borders of the Promised Land, their story reached a moment of profound reflection. They stood at the threshold of fulfillment, looking back at the journey that had shaped them. The plagues remained a defining memory. They were no longer simply events of the past. They had become the foundation for everything the community had become and everything they aspired to be. Their identity was inseparable from their liberation. Their ethics were inseparable from their memory. Their hope was inseparable from the God who had acted on their behalf. This moment of reflection deepened their understanding of the plagues as more than historical episodes. They saw them as part of a pattern in which divine justice confronts human oppression, in which the vulnerable are lifted up, and in which the powerful are held accountable. This pattern would continue to inform their interpretation of history long after they entered the land. Prophets and poets would return to the plagues repeatedly, drawing from them a vision of a world in which righteousness prevails. Israel's leadership also drew from this memory. Moses, nearing the end of his life, recounted the story of the plagues to remind the people of the responsibilities that came with freedom. He emphasized that liberation brought obligations to uphold justice, to remember the poor, to resist idolatry, and to maintain faithfulness. The plagues were a testament to divine power, but they were also a call to ethical living. Moses understood that memory alone could not sustain the community. It had to be translated into action. As Israel prepared to enter the land, they faced the challenge of translating the lessons of the plagues into a new context. They were no longer oppressed laborers, but a people about to become landowners, farmers, judges, and leaders. The temptation to replicate the systems of power they had escaped would be ever present. The memory of Egypt was meant to guard against this. The plagues served as a warning that any system that oppressed the vulnerable risked encountering the same divine justice that had fallen on Egypt. In this way, the plagues remained both an anchor and a guide. They anchored Israel's identity in the reality of divine intervention, and they guided their understanding of justice, power, and responsibility. As they looked towards the future, the plagues reminded them that their freedom came with a purpose, to embody a way of life that reflected the character of the God who had delivered them. By the time they stood poised to inherit the land, the plagues had become more than a story. They were the foundation of a worldview, the heart of a covenant, and the source of a national calling. Egypt's downfall had revealed the limits of human power. Israel's journey revealed the possibilities of divine guidance. Together, they formed a narrative that would shape generations. As Israel stood poised to enter the land that had been the focus of ancestral hope for centuries, the memory of the plagues remained at the center of their identity. These events were not merely episodes in a distant past. They were the lens through which the community understood both themselves and the world they were about to inhabit. The plagues had shattered the empire that once dominated their lives, but more importantly, they had reshaped the inner world of a people who now faced the challenge of building a society rooted in justice, memory, and covenant. The transition from wandering to settlement marked a profound shift. Egypt had imposed identity upon Israel through force. The wilderness had stripped away those imposed structures. The new land would require Israel to construct identity through choice. This movement from imposed identity to chosen identity was unprecedented. It demanded maturity, reflection, and commitment. The plagues, though long behind them physically, remained the foundation on which this new identity would be built. One of the most striking elements of this transition was how Israel was instructed to embed memory into every aspect of life. Festivals, agricultural practices, ethics, social structures, nearly all were shaped by the memory of Egypt. Passover remained the central ritual of remembrance, reenacted each year not as a reenactment of trauma, but as an affirmation of liberation. The unleavened bread symbolized readiness. The bitter herbs symbolized the harshness of bondage. The storytelling ritual ensured that generation after generation would internalize the narrative of their deliverance. In ancient societies, memory was not simply about recollection, it was about identity formation. The plagues functioned as a cultural and theological anchor, shaping Israel's worldview for centuries. While other nations traced their origins to heroic kings or mythic battles, Israel traced its identity to a divine act of deliverance performed on behalf of a vulnerable people. This distinction became essential to how Israel interpreted both its blessings and its responsibilities. To be the people who had been delivered from Egypt meant living with an awareness that freedom comes with moral demands. As they prepared to settle in the land, Israel was reminded repeatedly that the plagues were not simply demonstrations of power, but revelations of divine character. The God who had overturned the structures of an empire was also the God who cared for the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner. The plagues had revealed a deity who opposed oppression wherever it was found. This understanding infused Israel's legal system with compassion. Laws concerning debt release, land restitution, and humane treatment of servants all reflected the lessons embedded in the narrative of deliverance. The commandments insisting on justice and compassion were not arbitrary. They were rooted in Israel's own experience of marginalization. "You know the heart of the stranger," they were told, "for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." This statement captures the ethical revolution at the heart of Israel's calling. The plagues were not simply about defeating an empire, but about shaping a people who would model a different kind of society, one in which power served the vulnerable rather than exploited them. Yet, Israel's internalization of these lessons would be tested repeatedly. The memory of Egypt, powerful though it was, did not erase the human tendency toward forgetfulness and self-interest. As new generations arose, generations that had never known bondage firsthand, the narrative had to be taught, retaught, and preserved. Rituals, songs, laws, and festivals all served this purpose. The plagues became more than a historical account. They became a moral compass. In later centuries, as Israel faced threats from neighboring nations, internal corruption, and eventual exile, the memory of the plagues continued to serve as a guide and a source of hope. Prophets invoked the plagues to remind the people of their identity and their obligations. They reminded kings that their authority was conditional. They warned that Israel must not repeat Egypt's injustices. The plagues served both as a reminder of deliverance and a warning against complacency. Even when Israel faced overwhelming military or political challenges, the memory of Egypt provided assurance that history was not governed solely by human power. The plagues had shown that empires are not invincible and that divine justice can overturn systems of oppression. This understanding shaped Israel's resilience during times of exile and occupation. Their hope did not arise from military strength, but from the conviction that the same God who confronted Egypt could act again. The narrative of the plagues also influenced how Israel understood creation itself. In many ancient cultures, creation stories emphasize the struggle between gods or the establishment of cosmic order through violence. In Israel's memory, creation and salvation intertwined. The plagues had demonstrated that the creator of the natural world could reshape it to confront injustice. This understanding led Israel to view nature not as divine nor as chaotic, but as responsive to moral and covenantal realities. Rainfall, harvests, droughts, and abundance were interpreted through a framework shaped by the plagues. Nature was not indifferent. It was woven into a moral fabric that reflected divine purpose. As Israel contemplated their future in the land, they understood that their own behavior could determine whether the land flourished or faltered. They were told that the same God who delivered them would bless their fields, protect their boundaries, and provide for their needs if they lived in accordance with the covenant. But they were also warned that injustice, corruption, or idolatry could lead to consequences reminiscent of the plagues they had witnessed. The memory of Egypt served as both promise and warning. This dual role of the plagues, as both deliverance and judgment, became central to Israel's understanding of divine justice. The plagues demonstrated that God sides with the oppressed against those who misuse power. They also revealed that privilege and position offer no immunity from accountability. Egypt's downfall was not due to weakness. It was due to a misuse of strength. This insight shaped Israel's understanding of leadership, responsibility, and societal ethics. Power, in Israel's worldview, was a trust rather than an entitlement. Through centuries of retelling, the plagues came to represent a universal truth about the human condition. They were seen not only as events that occurred in a distant past, but as symbols of the dynamics between oppression and liberation, arrogance and humility, injustice and righteousness. In later literature and commentary, the plagues served as metaphors for spiritual transformation, ethical awakening, and divine intervention throughout history. In times of crisis, whether through foreign invasion, internal disorder, or exile, the memory of the plagues provided a framework for understanding suffering and hope. The plagues taught that history is not closed, that injustice is not permanent, and that divine intervention can reshape reality when least expected. This understanding sustained Israel through turbulent periods and gave meaning to their struggles. When Israel finally settled in the land and built a society structured around covenantal principles, the plagues became the backbone of their collective memory. They informed their sense of purpose, their relationship with the land, and their understanding of God. Even as centuries passed and political landscapes shifted, the memory remained central. Festivals continued, rituals endured, the narrative persisted. Yet the plagues did more than shape Israel. They reshaped the broader ancient Near Eastern imagination. Within surrounding cultures, the story of a deity who challenged an empire on behalf of a marginalized people stood out. It differed from narratives in which God supported kings and legitimized political dominance. This story presented a God who disrupted power structures rather than reinforced them. It contributed to a theological shift which divine justice was understood not simply as supporting the strong, but as defending the vulnerable. In time, the plagues became part of a global religious heritage, influencing interpretations of justice, liberation, and divine involvement across cultures and generations. Their impact extended far beyond the boundaries of Israel, carrying their message into communities and traditions that would emerge centuries later. And yet, at the heart of this expansive influence lies a profoundly human story, a people who had known suffering, who witnessed deliverance, who struggled with trust, and who carried memory into their future. The plagues were not abstract symbols to them. They were lived experience. They shaped the hopes of parents, the teachings given to children, the songs sung during festivals, and the laws that governed society. They also served as a reminder that history can turn in unexpected ways. A people enslaved for generations walked free. An empire considered invincible fell silent before forces it could neither anticipate nor control. The plague showed that the balance of power is not fixed, and that the moral arc of history bends differently than human rulers expect. As Israel entered the land, they carried with them not only the memory of what had happened in Egypt, but the responsibility to live differently because of it. Their story stands as a testament to the enduring truth that liberation, once given, must be preserved through justice, compassion, and faithfulness. The plagues revealed a divine commitment to these values. The people were called to embody them. Thus, the narrative that began with suffering in Egypt ends with a community prepared to build a society shaped by memory and hope. The plagues, though rooted in ancient history, continue to speak across time, reminding every generation that divine justice confronts human arrogance, that liberation emerges from unlikely places, and that the struggles of the vulnerable are never ignored by the one who intervened on their behalf. This is the legacy of the plagues, a story of judgment and mercy, destruction and creation, ending and beginning, a story that shaped a nation, a story that continues to shape the world.